It off. Fantastic. I think we're live now. All right. Well, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to another Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research webinar. It's great to have you all here with us, and it's particularly fantastic, I have to say, to have seen such a diversity of people that we've got in the audience today, which reflects the really broad interest in this topic. So in addition to the types of attendees we normally have, which we expect, so central and local government policymakers and practitioners and farming representatives and environmental consultants, that's our standard audience. We also have people today from the energy and transport and property and health and forestry sectors, which is really impressive and shows that there's already a good understanding of just how widely freshwater issues cut across what seem to be fairly divergent systems. This really is a unifying theme. So we're going to hear a bit more about that today, and also about the systems thinking methodology that has been applied and used in this work. And we'll be hearing from Justin Connolly and Melissa Robson very soon. So I'll just do a brief intro of them. Justin is director of Deliberate, which is a consultancy that specialises in the use of qualitative research and systems thinking to help understand complexity. His use of systems thinking draws on the field of system dynamics and participatory processes to build great system insights. He's worked across linked subject areas of climate action and policy, natural resource management, urban development, well-being and sustainable development. Kia ora, Justin. And Dr. Melissa Robson-Williams works at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research as a senior researcher in the environmental science and transdisciplinary research areas. She works in the landscape, people and governance team and manages the integrated land and water management research area. She may be known to many of you through her work on the Moving the Middle program, and has presented a webinar previously on the subject of agents of change. She specialises in the impacts of land use on water science and policy interactions, and she navigates complexity and the practice of integrative and transdisciplinary research. So Justin and Melissa will be presenting to us today. The other author who's been involved in this work, though, Dr. Nick Kirk, will join us at the end of the presentation, and he is going to facilitate the questions and answers today, which I typically do, but we wanted to have a chance for him to be involved, and also he'll probably do a better job of curating the questions because of his subject matter expertise. So due to technical difficulties we've had previously on this platform with the Q&A function, we're going to be using Mentimeter again today to receive the questions. So I will shortly pop something in the chat about how to access that once Justin has started presenting. Cameras and microphones are switched off for everyone. The chat will remain open, and I'll use it shortly to provide all that information. But our preference is to use Mentimeter if possible, so that others can see the questions and indicate their interest, and we can prioritise them accordingly. If you don't want to use Mentimeter, then you're very welcome to send either Nick, Kirk or I a Teams message directly with your question. As always, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website within the next few days, weeks probably, and we will also post up there a list of all of the questions that don't get answered today, alongside responses that Justin and Melissa and Nick will prepare for us. So I'll hand over to Justin now to start the presentation, and I'll be back briefly at the end. Justin, take us away.
Thank you. Kia ora. I'd like to start with a short story. When I was young, I wanted to be a detective. I could often be found investigating things around the house through my father's magnifying glass. If I looked at them through that glass, my parents would have seen me squinting, one eye closed and the other magnified to comedic proportions through the lens. As I grew into a teenager, I loved reading detective books and watching detective shows on TV. But in all good detective stories, the case is nearly always more complicated and nuanced than what it seems to be at the start. Over time, I came to realize that a good detective didn't only look through the magnifying glass. They also put that down, opened their other eye, and looked around them to understand the wider context and how that related to what they were investigating. Now, many decades later, myself and colleagues have worked to apply such detective skills to freshwater, resulting in this report, Wider Than Freshwater, How Non-Freshwater Related Activity Can Indirectly Influence and Have Impact on Freshwater Outcomes. We have used a systems thinking approach to look at impacts on freshwater. It is a joint report between Manaaki Whenua and Deliberate. Kia ora koutou, a very warm welcome to you and thank you for attending this seminar. My name is Justin Connolly. I'm the Director of Deliberate and one of the authors of this report. My two co-authors are Melissa Robson-Williams and Nick Kirk, both researchers at Manaaki Whenua. Melissa will be presenting the latter half of this webinar and Nick will be coordinating questions at the end. This is what we will cover today: why we did this work, our approach and methods, key insights, which is grouped in 3 areas, practical applications, and conclusions. This work is not a traditional look at freshwater through the lenses of the NPSFM, the NOF, or detailed discussions of water quality and water quantity. Rather, this report traverses a much wider range of subject matter. Therefore, in addition to the text in the report, we have tried to make the report as visual as possible to make these varied subject matters a bit accessible. And this presentation is also intended to be as visual as possible, drawing on illustrations used in the report. So why have we done this work? In Aotearoa, we all know that we've been experiencing issues with our water in recent decades. Water quality is often lower than desired and can be unsuitable for swimming or other uses, and pressures on how much gets used by humans is increasing. We recognise that the discussion around freshwater issues was sometimes narrow and potentially excluded a range of influences and factors that could also be having an impact. The authors each have their own experiences in freshwater, but we also sought to widen the perspective on the related factors that influence and impact the state of freshwater. We sought to highlight what can be seen through the magnifying glass and what can be seen when putting that down and looking around at the context. The hope is that this can contribute to more coordinated and impactful policies that contribute to improved freshwater outcomes. How did we do this? Firstly, we deliberately sought to interview a range of experts whose subject matter areas could have an impact on freshwater, but who are not always or usually directly included in the freshwater conversation. In addition to the author's own knowledge in freshwater, we sought input from specialists with expertise in areas like freshwater policy development, particularly with a focus on governance and community involvement, freshwater management perspectives, terrestrial and freshwater ecology, climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, energy generation and use, transitioning to a low carbon energy future, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and urban issues, biodiversity and biosecurity. We asked them what trends and patterns they were seeing in their work, which may be related to or impact on freshwater, and how. We then brought all this knowledge together in a causal diagram, which is a way of representing interconnection between a range of factors, and that's an important tool of systems thinking. Which brings us to the second element of our approach. We have used a systems thinking approach in this work. This was informed by the methodology of system dynamics, and this is explained more fully in the report. Yet the key thing to be aware of here is that this approach focuses on cause and effect, how some things have an impact on other things, but more importantly, how that causality can be articulated in feedback loops of influence. This is the concept that chains of influence can be circular and that they influence back on themselves and either reinforce or balance themselves out. Also, this approach is about synthesis, not analysis. It deliberately seeks to aggregate the detail of insights so that a wider perspective can be taken. The images you see in this presentation will be a mixture of causal diagrams, which are a key tool of systems thinking, and illustrations, which are visualizations to help get some of the subject matter across. Now, this approach allowed us to be participative, focus on the synthesis rather than the analysis and get a wider range of views in. Suggest a range of leverage points of increasing impacts, so where to intervene, and this in particular draws on literature by Donella Meadows, and suggest how this may be useful to a variety of users. I'll now cover the key insights. We'll split this area between Melissa and I, but the main overarching insight is there are lots of things that impact on freshwater that are not about freshwater. I will talk about two groups of influences. We call them specific and proximal, and broad and underlying. And then Melissa will talk about the leverage points and give some examples of those. Firstly, specific and proximal influences. These are insights that are clearly identifiable and where a pathway of influence can be described to freshwater. These also lend themselves to being captured in a causal diagram, like we have mentioned. These can be broadly grouped into two further groups. These are those usually incorporated in freshwater and those that are not. So think of those as the things that are viewed through the magnifying glass and the things we see if we put the magnifying glass down. So let's look at influences usually included in freshwater discussions first, or the things through the magnifying glass. We have represented these as a portion in our larger causal diagram. You'll see that some of that diagram in the background is faded out. We'll come to that later. Here you can see a range of influences that are connected via arrows and loops. And these are explained in the report, but they're highlighted by a grey background. The important thing to notice here is that this area in grey are the things that are normally included in the freshwater discussion. These are some themes and illustrations in this report that include things like water extraction, for example, municipal use, use for agriculture or other primary production and industries, ecosystem health throughout the length of catchments, including mitigations like plantings to reduce the impact of contaminants, and discussions relating to the development of water storage options. In relation to farmland, this usually includes discussions relating to the intensity of nitrogen inputs to land and potential nitrogen leaching to waterways, controlling inputs of other potential contaminants and seeking to manage the runoff, and the types of primary products land is used for or that it produces, as well as options for changing land uses to reduce the intensity of potential impacts and the potential financial implications for those working the land. So those are the specific and proximal things that are normally or often included, seen through the magnifying glass. We now turn to the rest of the specific and proximal things that can be seen when we put the magnifying glass down and then look around at the wider context. Here we show the complete causal diagram that we drew, and we draw your attention to the areas with the white background, those outside of the grey area. These are things that have an influence on freshwater, but which are not usually included in the freshwater discussion. Some of these includes things that may sometimes be included, like the role of permanent forestry, either indigenous or exotic. Some people may experience this in freshwater. It's not always the case. And green infrastructure and green spaces as well, mostly in urban areas, but also in rural areas. And then there's many things which are usually not included. Now, these could be things like the cost and supply chain of nutrient inputs to land, such as in fertiliser, the greenhouse gas emissions profile of fertilisers, both from their production and their use, our spiralling reliance on fertilisers for our primary industries, and the form our urban areas take, as well as the relationship between our urban areas and where they meet primary productive land. For example, the dominant low density nature and high emissions profile of urban areas and their transport activities, as well as the desire to release capital gains from farmland through suburban development. These can lead to intensification of activity on reduced amounts of productive land and the emissions impact on freshwater in the much longer term through a changed climate. Also, the efficiency or not of our energy use and how that energy is generated, recognising that even renewable energy has a greenhouse gas emissions profile. So these are all of the things that are represented in the balance of the illustration here. And now we'll just show that complete illustration representing all of those things in the causal diagram. I'll now turn to the broad and underlying influences. Now, these are a range of things that did not lend themselves to being captured easily in the causal diagram. These tend to be social or non-physical in nature. They may be less visible and subtly influencing a range of areas across all or many parts of the causal diagram. So these have been captured in narrative form. Firstly, there are a range of institutional influences. This includes decision-making approaches and whether these include power sharing or devolution, and the extent that they may or may not involve collaboration, or whether that had an impact. There's also elements relating to the trust in institution and the length of political and funding cycles. Secondly, some difficult to measure or non-measurable things that are important in life, like the benefit of non-financial returns and things that cannot be measured in dollars, a declining level of ecological literacy across the population, which has been trending down, and declining levels of time spent in or near nature, especially by default in the way that we live, declining levels of mental health or well-being, and social justice and inequality, which may sound unrelated, but were pointed out by several experts as being likely to disrupt any ability to implement good policy if things continue to follow declining growth trends. Thirdly, the increased appreciation that climate change is a risk and that we need to be more resilient. And finally, consideration of a lower energy future. This speaks to the fact that the energy transition ahead of us is not just one from fossil fuels to renewables, but from fossil fuels to renewable energy and using a far lower level of total energy than we currently use now. This will impact many activities associated with freshwater use or potentially mitigation. I'll now hand over to Melissa to talk about the concept of leverage points.
Thanks, Justin. So one of the really useful things about system dynamics is that it's a methodology that can help point to places to intervene in a system. And these places are also called leverage points. So leverage points occur at different places, different levels in that system. And different system scholars have described these levels in different ways. Some in terms of the system changes that are actually being targeted, like changes in parameters or changes in feedback. And others have classified them as shallower, medium, and deeper, or lower, moderate, and higher. So they're not value judgments. They're an indication of what those interventions are likely to be able to do and the level of change that they're likely to be able to bring about. So we've used 3 levels in our work and described these as tweaking the system, changing the rules of the system, and changing the goals of the system. So at this level, interventions are tweaking the system. So they're changing rates or buffers, speeding something up or slowing something down, but the fundamental structure of and the purpose of the system remains the same. So they're often targeted at improving efficiency. Interventions at this level are changing the rules of the system. So perhaps through creating new ways of doing things, new information flows, new networks or relationships that change the way that we do things, and ultimately the system structure. And interventions at this level are changing the purpose or the goal of the system. So often looking at the mindsets or the mental models and ways of seeing the world that have created the existing system in the first place. And the notion of leverage is that an intervention at this point here, if you have enough force, you can move that system on the left-hand side a bit. But intervening here, if it's effective, you can move the system on the left-hand side by a lot. So, we identified 30 potential leverage points from the specific and proximal and the broad and underlying topics that Justin's just described, and classified them into these 3 leverage levels. In the interest of time, I won't go through all 30. I'll just give 3 examples of each. So in the tweaks to the system, the shallow leverage level, some examples that we identified were water use efficiency measures. So these measures improve or reduce water use, but changes in the rates of water use still retain the same fundamental water-dependent kind of system structures that existed beforehand. For example, say irrigation and farming. So changing the efficiency, not the rules or the structure. So they're considered lower leverage, not important, but lower leverage at a wider systems level. The same goes for water storage. So water storage increases the temporary buffer of water available for use, but doesn't change those fundamental water-dependent characteristics of the system. A straight switch from renewable energy equivalents would also be a lower leverage, unless, as Justin mentioned, accompanied with a reducing overall energy demand, as the manufacturing of renewable technologies still emits greenhouse gases, which in turn impact on the water cycle in various ways. In the changing the rules of the game leverage point, the medium leverage, some examples that we identified were treating electricity as a precious resource. This change in the way that we do things would encourage both lower energy farming practices and higher density and higher energy efficiency houses. Over time, for example, in an increased housing density would reduce the land used for suburban development and the associated conversion of often high quality agricultural land near urban areas, and the subsequent impact on water, both from those impervious surfaces and from food production needing to intensify on other perhaps less suitable land. Secondly, coordinating national policy statements to be collectively consistent. So while the different national policy statements seek to achieve different goals, identifying the interactions between national policy statement areas, where they overlap, where they complement, and importantly, where they conflict, and internally resolving those tensions would definitely support their coordination and implementation with clear impacts on freshwater. And the third example of these moderate ones is reducing fertilizer dependence. So fertilizer is a key driver of intensification, obviously, which has direct impacts on water, but also reduced fertilizer production would help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which have that much longer feedback to water. And the last one, in the changing the goals of the system and the deeper leverage levels, some examples we identified were helping people recognize that they are a part of nature, not apart from it. So this involves a change in mindset to acknowledge our relationship with and dependence on the natural world, ultimately impacting on how we would consider, value, and treat water. Seeking to change the focus of asset management to more typically include appreciating assets like green infrastructure. This would mean a shift in the mindset of how green assets are viewed in council accounting systems, and therefore the extent to which they are deployed, for example, through water-sensitive green infrastructure or urban design. And thirdly, seeking to change the dominant culture of building wealth through housing. So over time, this would mean a move away from suburban and low density forms of housing and that pressure on the near urban agricultural soils that we mentioned before. So when we'd identified these 30 leverage points, 3 things popped out at us that were really interesting and also quite typical of systems. So one was how many of the interventions that benefited water weren't obviously water related. 2, that some of the interventions seemed either counterintuitive or they seemed like they would be deeper than they actually are, sort of a deeper leverage point than they actually are. And thirdly, some interventions look doable and some look so far out of our power to change. But it's often these big picture societal ones that are at the root of many social and environmental challenges. So managing to influence them just a bit would have a much broader impact. So those are some of the insights about the specific and proximal, the broad and underlying, and the leverage points. So we now have a few ways that we think that you could embed some of these insights into your work. So firstly, find champions who can bring the big picture together. So systems thinking will benefit what you do, but not everybody needs a systems expert. So if you're really keen to bring that systems thinking into your work immediately, team up, find people who can help take the important things from all of those different magnifying glasses and stitch them together. Secondly, look at the interconnections. In the systems map and the broad and underlying topics that Justin highlighted, there are multiple levels or multiple points of interconnection. These points of crossover can be crossovers between departments, between local and regional authority, between even policy statements. So use these crossovers to identify existing and new colleagues and start a discussion. Think about how your work might affect each other and see what you might work on together. And thirdly, consider multiple pathways. So any significant change in our freshwater system is likely to be the result of interventions at multiple points on the system at multiple levels. So consider your work and what your organization that you work for is trying to do. What sort of outcomes are you trying to achieve? Does your work fit into any of the described leverage points in the report? And now consider whether there are other pathways that you could use, other leverage points that you could intervene at to bring about the desired result, remembering that different interventions are capable of different degrees of change. Some ones might be very direct and obvious, others might take some time, but potentially be more suited to a bigger degree of change. And this is the power of systems thinking, that it can help illuminate multiple potential pathways and opportunities, essentially giving us more tools in the toolbox.
And that brings us to the end of our very brief presentation of a very wide range of subject matter areas relating to freshwater. Look, thank you very much for attending. We hope that this work can help you recognise the benefit of using systems thinking in your work to help take a wider view of activities and coordinating policy areas that can impact on freshwater. We hope you might reflect on yourselves or others, where you may be looking through the magnifying glass and where you may also look outside of the magnifying glass at the wider context. As one of our expert interviewees noted, recognising complexity is one thing, embracing it is the next. So we certainly enjoy talking about this sort of thing. Would welcome the opportunity to discuss these concepts with anybody. If they are interested, please reach out. We now have time for questions. Not a lot of time, but we'll try and answer as many as we can. Our co-author, Nick Kirk, will be curating some of the questions that have been coming through. If you are interested in downloading the report, I believe a link to the Manaaki Whenua site and where you can download that from is being pasted in the chat. You could go and do that now. If you'd like a physical copy of the report, send an email to Nick at the email on the screen with your name and postal address. And we'll answer a few questions now. Anyone not able to answer, we'll distribute written answers to later on to those emails that have been registered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you everyone for coming along to our presentation today. We only have very limited amount of time for questions. One question that's come through has been around if we had purposely excluded iwi and Indigenous perspectives from the system diagram. So I'm just wondering if Justin and Melissa, you can explain our approach there.
Absolutely. We did interview some people who had either a direct experience, lived in the Te Ao Māori world or were sympathetic to a Te Ao Māori perspective. We recognise, though, that to attempt to align the concepts of Te Ao Māori with the systems thinking approach may have compromised or not fully represented Te Ao Māori perspectives. So we haven't represented it directly because we didn't want to do it in injustice. But what we believe this document can do is assist the co-development of policy with Māori by supporting more systemic and interconnected thinking by policymakers less familiar with the Te Ao Māori worldview. So I hope that answers the question to an extent.
Thank you, Justin. Just one other question that's come through on Mentimeter is, how do you see individuals or companies managing the cost of system change, for example, reducing fertiliser reliance on farms, and where does the responsibility lie? So yeah, Justin, Melissa.
I was going to say, Melissa or me. Great question. The short answer is probably a shared responsibility, like in terms of looking for opportunities to can potentially spread that load in ways that might be non-financial or the way that other things work. A difficult question to answer in terms of specific
in the abstract
examples and context, in the abstract. But one that we'd be happy to explore via email or somebody following up with us if that was of interest.
Thank you for that, Justin. I realise we're at 12, so I might reach out to Joe and ask, do we wrap up here, or is there time for more questions?
Thanks for that, Nick. Look, we do normally wrap up right on time, and there are lots of questions I see in the chat that we haven't answered, but as I said before, we will prepare a written kind of questions and answers sheet for that and load that onto the website when we post the recording as well. So if you are still here and you have more questions, please do go to Mentimeter and put them in now so that we can capture that, take a record of it, and follow up with you afterwards. But yes, we will need to wrap it up there for today. Thanks so much for your time, your expertise, and a very engaging and colourful. I loved all your graphics. A very engaging presentation on that front.